Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're zooming in on a really crucial moment from the September 2025 UN General Assembly. Our mission is to really analyze this one critical meeting, U.S. President Donald Trump sitting down with leaders from 8 major Arab and Muslim nations about the war in Gaza, which has been going on for nearly 2 years now.
And we absolutely have to set the stage here. The stakes were incredibly high. This meeting happened, as you said, almost 2 years into a conflict with just devastating human costs. Gaza's Ministry of Health figures point to over 65,000 Palestinians reportedly killed, mostly civilians. And this is happening amid, UN warnings about widespread famine, relentless destruction. So this wasn't just another diplomatic meet and greet. It was really driven by extreme urgency.
Okay, right. Let's try and unpack this then. You've got these attendees, these nations who have fundamentally different expectations, different goals even. So what vision did President Trump actually lay out for them? And maybe the bigger question is, why did everyone involved, coming from these different places, see this specific meeting as their most important meeting of the whole UNGA session? I mean, just look at who was in the room. President Trump met with leaders from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, Indonesia, and Pakistan. That lineup itself is, well, it's a pretty formidable diplomatic group, isn't it? It represents huge populations, economic weight.
Oh, absolutely. That list screams global significance. Now, from Trump's angle, sources are suggesting the whole point was to offer a concrete plan, a path forward to end the war. The proposal seems quite structural. It reportedly detailed, how the Israeli military might withdraw eventually, how regional leaders would potentially send in troops to maintain security, keep order, and crucially, how the rebuilding process, which is going to be immense, would actually start and, importantly, get funded.
But the Arab leaders, they apparently cut right to the chase, focusing on the immediate disaster. We have that reported opening from the Qatari prime minister, right? He basically said their one goal, the unifying goal, was to stop the war and bring the hostages back. And to help the people in Gaza, acknowledging, I think his words were, the situation is very, very, very bad there.
Yeah, exactly. They were putting that immediate humanitarian need ahead of future governance talks.
Right, prioritizing the immediate stop over the long-term structure.
And that clarity, that urgency wasn't lost on President Trump either, it seems. He actually highlighted it himself, didn't he?
Right.
Said that out of all the meetings he had at UNGA, 32 of them, including talks with major world powers, this one, these 8 nations, was his most important meeting.
Yeah, calling it the most important, that's a significant label. It really underlines the pressure, the diplomatic weight in that room.
Okay, so let's get into the retorted details of this U.S. plan itself. And we should probably stress, the specifics are coming filtered through unnamed sources, Israeli and Arab sources, which means, we might be seeing information shaped by the interests of whoever's leaking it. But what seems consistent across reports is that the plan sees zero future role for Hamas.
Right.
Which aligns with the U.S. and Israeli demand that Hamas must be, disarmed and dismantled.
Okay, so that's the baseline. No Hamas. That's the non-negotiable starting point for the U.S. side, apparently. But here's where it gets tricky, right? Sources also suggest this plan was not actually drafted by Israel, though Prime Minister Netanyahu is definitely kept in the loop about the details.
Exactly. And the really critical part, the potential flashpoint, is that this plan apparently envisions some kind of future involvement for the Palestinian Authority, the PA.
Right.
The body that governs parts of the West Bank currently.
Right.
And this flies directly in the face of Israel's position. They've repeatedly said they will not accept the PA having a role in governing Gaza after the conflict.
So the U.S. is essentially pushing for the PA, which puts their own plan immediately at odds with Israel's very public red lines. What's the thinking there? Why take that risk?
Well, the reported U.S. rationale seems to be pragmatic, perhaps. That only an existing, recognized structure like the PA, even with all its flaws, could possibly prevent a total security and administrative collapse once Israel withdraws. Because Israel can't, or likely won't, fill that vacuum alone long term. This was supposedly the main selling point to the Arab leaders. Look, without the PA, who runs things? Who keeps the lights on, runs schools, hospitals? The U.S. seems to be trying to force a governance answer to make an Israeli withdrawal feasible.
And while this is being debated, you already have regional players stepping up, like Indonesia's President Prabowo Subianto. Indonesia, one of the largest Muslim-majority nations. He apparently proactively offered Indonesian peacekeeping forces for Gaza. That's a pretty major commitment.
It is. It shows some regional buy-in for a post-conflict security arrangement, at least in principle.
Okay, now let's pivot to the immediate issue that was driving the desperation for a truce, the hostages. Sources indicate these talks were happening while Hamas had its own counterproposal on the table, right? U.S. media cited senior officials talking about a letter held by Qatar as the mediator, drafted by Hamas. And it apparently proposed a 60-day truce.
A 60-day truce specifically guaranteed by President Trump himself. That guarantee part seems key.
Okay, 60 days guaranteed by Trump. And what was Hamas offering in return?
In exchange for that 2-month pause, the proposal was reportedly for the immediate release of half of the remaining captives. There were thought to be 48 still held at that point.
Half, so about 24 people.
Well, and here's the tragic detail. Sources were indicating only about 20 of those 48 were actually believed to be alive. The others were the bodies of captives who had died or been killed.
Oh, that's grim. So release maybe 20 living hostages and some remains for a 60-day truce. It sounds painful, but maybe like a possible step. Get a pause, save those who are left alive. But is a 60-day truce, even with a Trump guarantee, really stable, given how past deals just evaporated?
Well, history certainly casts a long shadow here. That's exactly why the focus on a Trump guarantee is so prominent in these reports. You just have to look back a bit to see the level of, frankly, deep mistrust. Earlier that same month, September, there was apparently real progress on talks, and then it completely collapsed when the Israeli military launched what were described as unprecedented air attacks on Qatar.
On Qatar itself?
Yeah, reportedly targeting the Hamas leadership who were actually involved in those negotiations. It just shattered the process.
Wow, and that wasn't even the first time something like that happened, was it?
Not at all. It echoed an earlier failure back in March. The deal was apparently secured then, too. Israel got several captives released and then almost immediately followed up with intense airstrikes and imposed that total blockade.
The one that led to the current famine warnings.
Precisely. That blockade directly contributed to the conditions of mass starvation the UN is warning about. So the pattern is, it's pretty clear. Military actions have consistently blown up diplomatic efforts. And that history of failure is exactly why these Arab leaders felt they needed something much stronger than just another temporary deal. They needed, or felt they needed, ironclad pressure from Washington embodied in that Trump guarantee.
And all this is happening against a backdrop where the kind of international mood is shifting, isn't it? We're seeing more countries moving towards recognizing Palestinian statehood, France, the UK, Canada, Australia, Portugal, others mentioned.
Yeah.
And the frustration from Arab nations is becoming really public. You had the Emir of Qatar giving that very strong speech at the UNGA, calling Israel a rogue state.
Yeah, the diplomatic temperature was definitely rising. You feel that deep sense of impatience, of anger building internationally.
So, okay, you've got this pressure cooker, stalled talks, deals collapsing, rising international condemnation, humanitarian catastrophe, maximum frustration, really. And yet these Arab leaders reportedly came into this meeting with Trump feeling somewhat optimistic. Why?
Well, it seems their strategy wasn't just about venting frustration. It was about leverage. Sources suggest they believed they needed to change Trump's mind on the policy in Gaza. There was a feeling, perhaps, that he was only getting one side of the story inside the White House.
Right, try to present the other side, change the calculus.
Exactly. And this is where things take a really interesting turn, because it's something completely separate that happened at the UNGA, U.S. policy towards Ukraine.
Ukraine, how does that connect?
That connection, that parallel, seems to have been seen as a major potential opening. It shifted the whole dynamic of leverage, apparently.
Okay, wait, so how did a shift on Ukraine potentially create an opening on Gaza? Walk us through that.
Well, President Trump's previous stance on Ukraine had been, shall we say, ambiguous, sometimes even leaning against high levels of continued U.S. support for Kyiv. But then, during this UNGA, he seemed to execute what news outlets were calling a full 180-degree turn.
A 180? How so?
He suddenly stated that Ukraine could actually win the war, provided the EU stepped up its support, and he even, quite dramatically, called Russia a paper tiger.
Wow, okay. That is a big shift from his prior rhetoric. And the EU welcomed this change, presumably.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. European leaders were reportedly quite pleased with this unexpected shift in the U.S. position.
So it's kind of extraordinary, isn't it? You have these leaders representing, billions of people, huge nations, and their strategy for this incredibly urgent Gaza crisis hinges on reading the tea leaves of the U.S. president's mood, based on a sudden policy shift about a completely different war thousands of miles away.
Precisely. That's exactly how the Arab leaders reportedly saw it. This sudden, very public reversal on Ukraine was viewed as a golden opportunity. The thinking seems to have been, okay, President Trump is showing he's listening to different and new ideas today. He's capable of making a dramatic pivot. So maybe, just maybe, they could persuade him to make a similar pivot on Gaza. If he could change his tune on Russia, maybe he could be convinced to apply real pressure on Netanyahu.
So it wasn't about the substance of Ukraine policy, it was about the demonstration of flexibility.
Exactly. It was seen as proof that the president was, perhaps, newly open to persuasion, newly malleable on foreign policy. It was a diplomatic gamble, basically, betting on perceived presidential flexibility.
Which brings us right back to the core issue, the fundamental geopolitical reality here. The central challenge, diplomatically speaking, is pretty stark, isn't it? Israel really only has one indispensable backer, one country providing the bulk of the money, the advanced weapons, and crucially, the diplomatic shield at the UN Security Council, and that's the United States.
Undeniable.
Therefore, in the eyes of this entire group of Arab and Muslim leaders, Donald Trump is the key man. He's the one person with the power to fundamentally alter the situation on the ground.
Yeah, the entire diplomatic effort, the hope for breaking the cycle, seems to have been pinned on his willingness to use that unique leverage, potentially influenced by these unrelated foreign policy shifts.
So, wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you listening in? We've got this U.S. plan that tries to bring in the Palestinian Authority, but that immediately clashes with Israel's stated position for Gaza's future. You have Arab leaders pushing hard for an immediate stop to the fighting, pushing a hostage deal that relies heavily on this Trump guarantee because they just don't trust temporary ceasefires anymore after years of failure.
Right.
And underpinning all of this was this fragile hope, this gamble, really, that they could engineer a major U.S. policy shift on Gaza by pointing to a completely separate, sudden pivot on Ukraine.
Yeah, what's really striking, I think, is the sheer tactical nature of the diplomacy happening in that UNGA corridor. These leaders weren't just making moral arguments. They were trying to leverage the U.S. president's perceived change of heart on Eastern Europe, treating it not as some random event, but as potential proof that a similar massive shift on Middle East policy was actually achievable right then and there. They were essentially betting that the political logic, whatever it was, that allowed a U-turn on Ukraine could be replicated for Gaza.
So here's a thought to leave you with. If the global community, or at least a huge bloc representing major Muslim nations, genuinely believes that the actions of one single leader hold the decisive key to ending a brutal, nearly 2-year-long war, what does that intense concentration of perceived power tell us about how global conflicts might be resolved or not resolved in the future? And what stands out to you about using strategy in one conflict zone as direct leverage in another? Something to think about.